We welcome you to another Sunday School lesson. Sunday School is a blessing and gift from God. This chapter continues Jesus' preaching during the Feast of Booths, where he once again comes into conflict with local religious leaders. This encounter will become more and more heated. Eventually, Jesus' opponents are enraged enough to attempt killing him right then and there. Jesus' response to a trap sprung by the Pharisees is masterful. Though he alone has the moral authority to execute the woman for her sin, Jesus instead chooses forgiveness. This highlights a major concept of Christian ethics: just because one has the power to do something does not mean it's the best option. Our first verse says, "But Jesus went to the Mount of Olives." In anticipation of his arrest and betrayal, Jesus returns to the Mount of Olives to pray one last time. He returns to the place where King David fled from his son Absalom, where King Solomon worshipped idols, where the prophets Ezekiel and Zechariah prophesied, and where he himself prayed, taught, and prophesied. The prophet Zechariah prophesied that Jesus would return there on the Mount of Olives, Zechariah 14:4. The Mount of Olives provides the reminder that just as the olive was pressed for oil to anoint kings, our King was pressed so that he would one day rule as everlasting King. Verse 2 says, "At dawn he appeared again in the temple courts, where all the people gathered around him, and he sat down to teach them." Scripture often records Jesus speaking and teaching to crowds. It is Jesus' growing attention from the people of Jerusalem which worries the local religious leaders. In this passage, they once again attempt to trick Jesus in order to ruin his reputation with the people. Unlike other attempts, however, this one involves both a moral dilemma and a powerful, real-life example. Jesus' response to this trap teaches us about the importance of restraint, as well as sound judgment. Verse 3 says, "The teachers of the law and the Pharisees brought in a woman caught in adultery. They made her stand before the group." At various times in Jesus' public ministry, he was challenged by religious leaders, such as the Pharisees. Here, the Pharisees introduce a real-life, flesh and blood moral dilemma, both unexpected and scandalous. A woman had been caught in adultery, most likely, not moments before being brought to Jesus, but at some time previously. This entire episode is an attempt by the Pharisees to show that they, not Jesus, are truly following the law, because they caught this adulterous woman. The Pharisees intended drama to make this as public as possible, so that Jesus' response can be given as much notice as possible, so they made her stand before the crowd. Verse 4 says, "And said to Jesus, 'Teacher, this woman was caught in the act of adultery.'" The Pharisees highlight Jesus' reputation by referring to him as teacher. This is part of their intent, to prove to the people that Jesus is not a figure worth following. It is unlikely that the woman was caught in the act moments prior and dragged directly in front of Jesus. More than likely, this was a woman who'd been previously found out, and carefully chosen by the Pharisees in advance. The Pharisees will point out the Old Testament law which required the death penalty for adulterers, Leviticus 20:10, Deuteronomy 22:22. What they will fail to mention, however, is that the law did not merely require that they stone such women, but that they stone both of the guilty ones. In other words, in trying to prove their own allegiance to the law, these men are falling short of it, because they have not brought the guilty man as well. Verse 5 says, "In the law Moses commanded us to stone such women. Now what do you say?" Leviticus prescribed the death penalty for couples who committed adultery. However, the Pharisees who have brought this woman have only accused half of the guilty parties, the woman. This raises a serious problem with their attack on Jesus. Their goal is to trick Jesus into making one of two mistakes. As they see it, Jesus can either stone the woman, ruining his reputation for mercy, and putting himself at legal risk, or he can refuse and defy the law of Moses. In trying to show their superiority, however, these men have failed to fully follow the law themselves. They have not brought the guilty man. Verse 6 says, they were using this question as a trap in order to have a basis for accusing him. But Jesus bent down and started to write on the ground with his finger. Jesus does not take the bait. Interestingly, Jesus says nothing at first. Instead, he begins to write on the ground. This puzzling detail is one of the New Testament's richest sources of speculation. The Bible does not say exactly what Christ is writing. Perhaps he is writing the exact Old Testament quotations these men are citing to him. Maybe he is writing the names of the critics, alongside their own sins. Or, as some have pointed out, Jesus may have been writing a question along the lines of where is the man who was also caught in the act. While we don't know what Jesus wrote, we do see how he turns the hypocrisy of these Pharisees against them. They were not wrong to seek justice under the law. However, they are clearly not following it fully, since they have only brought half of the guilty ones. And, God's law also prioritized mercy over blind punishment. Verse 7 says, when they kept on questioning him, he straightened up and said to them, let any one of you who is without sin be the first to throw a stone at her. The trap laid by the Pharisees seems to present Jesus with a dilemma. The law does call for death for adulterers. However, Roman law prohibits Jewish leaders from using the death penalty. As always though, Jesus' response cuts through the trap. His writing in the dirt is suggesting that whatever he wrote was a deliberate part of his response. When he finally speaks, Jesus points out one of the areas where his critics are themselves falling short of the law. Accusers are supposed to be the ones to begin the execution process, Deuteronomy 17:7. In blunt terms, Jesus is saying, if you're going to apply the law, then go ahead and follow it. Here, he points out that the law also requires the accusers to begin the stoning process. Whomever caught the woman in the act was supposed to initiate her death. Jesus points out that the scribes and Pharisees are not actually interested in following the law. If they were, they'd at least follow the entire law, and not merely use it as a cheap publicity stunt. A complete submission to God means more than legalism, it also means using right judgment. Verse 8 says, again he stooped down and wrote on the ground. This is the second time in a few short verses where Jesus is said to have written on the ground. In fact, he apparently does not stop writing until after all of the accusers have left. The Bible is completely silent on exactly what Jesus was carving into the dust. The fact that it's mentioned more than once suggests that it's an important part of his response. He might have been writing Old Testament scriptures which supported his point. Or, as some have suggested, he may have been recording the names and sins of some of the woman's accusers. One can assume that whatever he wrote was at least part of the reason the Pharisees and scribes abandoned their attempt. Verse 56 says, your father Abraham rejoiced at the thought of seeing my day, he saw it and was glad. Once again, Abraham is invoked in this debate. Jesus has pointed out that spiritual matters, not genealogy, make a person a true son of Abraham. In saying this, Jesus has implied that those who accept his words will not taste death. His critics misunderstand this as a reference to physical death. Jesus, however, is referring to salvation. Here, he clarifies by saying that Abraham's faith looked forward to the promised one, and Jesus is that one. Therefore, when Jesus claims to bring a message which frees men from death, that message includes those who came before him, such as Abraham. In making this statement, Jesus implies that he witnessed Abraham's life in a direct, personal way. Verse 57 says, "You are not yet 50 years old," they said to him, "and you have seen Abraham." A common theme in Jesus' interaction with his critics was that of misunderstanding. More often than not, Jesus' words were interpreted in an overly literal, physical sense. In fact, most of what Jesus taught was meant to be understood in a spiritual sense. In the prior verse, Jesus referred to Abraham, noting that even he looked forward to the coming of a promised one. But the remark made by Jesus implies that his knowledge is personal, direct, and innate. This leads to another misunderstanding, delivered with palpable sarcasm: "Abraham has been dead for thousands of years, how can you claim to have seen him?" Verse 58 says, "Very truly I tell you," Jesus answered, "before Abraham was born, I am." Now, Jesus is responding to disbelief from his critics. "You're not even 50, how can you have seen Abraham?" Jesus answers with what some refer to as the hidden "I am" statement, since it's not typically counted among the others. Ironically, this is perhaps the most direct of all of Jesus' uses of this phrase. The meaning is certainly not lost on his critics. When Jesus claims the title of "I am," everyone listening knows exactly what he means, that he is God, John 10:33. Those who suggest that Jesus never actually claimed to be God should consider the reaction of the religious leaders to his words. They are so enraged that they attempt to stone Jesus right then and there. Our final verse says, "At this, they picked up stones to stone him, but Jesus hid himself, slipping away from the temple grounds." In this conversation, Jesus has not only called his critics liars and children of the devil, he has directly claimed the same name as God. If this is not true, it is blasphemy. The fact that these men so immediately picked up stones proves their opinion of which option applied. But most likely, Jesus simply left or exited in such a way that his attackers failed to reach him. In other cases, such as when he will be surrounded on a high ledge near the temple, there's a greater chance that his escape was enabled by supernatural means. In any event, Jesus has made his views on their hypocrisy and spiritual state very clear, and they have once again failed to silence him. Jesus prevents 2 stonings. In this lesson we learn that Jesus Christ clearly stated that he was God. We also see that some people thought he was a demon-possessed liar, who could not implement God's justice. Jesus could have condemned her. He was the only one there who could. Yet in an incredible act of grace, he chose not to. The woman had been caught in the very act of sin. And apart from the hypercritical legal experts who tried to use her, Jesus pardoned the guilty and sent her on her way to sin no more. In the ears of the guilty who deserve death for their sins, even the "go and sin no more" must sound like a grand gesture of mercy. In fact, it was. Jesus prevents 2 stonings. 1. Jesus shows how to keep cool, John 8:6. This was no emergency. Jesus models the humility and self-control of a leader who is quick to listen, slow to speak, and slow to be provoked, James 1:19. 2. Jesus shows no bias toward women and sexual sin, John 8:6-7. Jesus seems to understand that much of what looked like sexual sin was actually women being taken advantage of and mistreated. He is more interested to extend mercy and forgiveness to the undeserving, and bring justice to the overpowered and abused. 3. Jesus said he and the Jews had different fathers, John 8:38. Jesus clearly said he existed before Abraham and he is absolutely equal with Almighty God. This statement made the Jews very angry. We are truly glad you spent time to learn this lesson with us. We hope you are blessed and may share these with somebody else. Thank you very much, have a great week, and God bless you always, dear brothers and sisters.